Today's story began on a Saturday evening in July 2011 during a dance lesson when Joseph Sonnier, a respected and wealthy pathologist, first met Richelle Tina, a single man, famous in his city and beyond, enjoying freedom, status, and money, and a beautiful, sweet woman, almost 10 years younger than Joseph, successful in living a life of pleasure. Meeting on the dance floor was the beginning of their story, which unfortunately ended in tragedy. At that moment, when the ideal partnership in the dance grew into a tender and passionate romance, no one could not even imagine what events would follow after a while. The biography of Joseph Sonnier, before meeting Richelle, is a path full of joys and tragedies. Born in 1955 in a respected family of doctors in Shreveport, Louisiana, Joseph from childhood dreamed of continuing the work of the family and become a doctor. With outstanding abilities, the young man earned a Bachelor of Science in Medical Science cum laude from the University of Baton Rouge in 1976. He then applied to Louisiana State University in Shreveport and began working at Parkland Hospital in Dallas, Texas. The young man perfectly combined his university studies and work. Wanting to achieve professionalism in his chosen activity, he constantly took additional workload at the university and honed his knowledge and practice at the hospital. The management noticed the success and zeal of the young employee, and in the last year of training he received the position of chief resident. Upon completion of his studies, Joseph chose the field of pathologic anatomy, later becoming a respected pathologist and laboratory director in Lubbock, Texas. Joseph's life was marked by the tragic loss of the woman he loved. His marriage, which lasted 27 years and which he considered happy, ended in divorce. His wife fell in love with another man. Joseph accepted her choice and agreed to divorce, believing that the man he loved had found his happiness. Dr. Sonnier had a strong character and a great sense of nobility and responsibility. After the divorce, he maintained a very warm relationship with Becky and continued to support his two sons, showing resilience and strength of character. When Becky died 2 years later at the hands of her new husband Joseph, shocked by the heinous death of his former spouse, once again experienced a wave of grief and loss. He repeatedly recalled the family years gone by and mourned the loss. However, the doctor remained a pillar for the family. He immediately took over all the organizational issues and funeral expenses and helped his sons to survive the trauma. The children later admitted that it was his support that helped each of them overcome the pain. The tragedy left a deep mark on Joseph's heart. For a while, he fully devoted himself to work and the upbringing of two sons. Later, the grief he experienced led to a reassessment of life. The man decided to start a new personal chapter in a new city and with a new woman. In 2007, Dr. Sonnier moved with his sons from Dallas to Lubbock, Texas, where he accepted a position as chief pathologist at Covenant Health System. Feeling the need for something new to refresh him and fill the void inside, Joseph enrolled in a local dance studio. He enjoyed the classes, also because it was a place where he met different women. A couple of times he even tried unsuccessfully to build relationships with his dance partners. And then, one warm summer evening, Richelle Tina appeared at the dance class. Elegant, graceful, refined woman with a sense of humor and lively eyes attracted Dr. Sonnier's attention at first sight. Her smile lit up the room, and Joseph realized she was exactly who he was looking for. Richelle, for her part, also noticed the confident and respectful man moving deftly on the dance floor. Richelle, 47, and Joseph, 57, paired up, complementing each other perfectly in the dance. With each new session, they realized they were growing closer. Dr. Sonnier suggested dating, and Richelle agreed. Thus began a new, as it seemed at the time, happy chapter in the lives of both of them. Richelle had an attractive and innate charm that had such a strong influence on men that they were willing to change their lives, destroy marriages, and commit criminal acts for her. Richelle was one of those women who have a unique magnetism, attract attention, and cause passion. Such are called fatal women. Joseph and Richelle's paths would not cross until a July evening because she had previously lived in Amarillo, a couple hours by car from Lubbock. In fact, they were both starting a new life with a clean slate after personal love dramas. Leaving Amarillo, Dr. Sonnier's new lover was running away from the fear and anxiety associated with Mike Dixon, owner of a private clinic in plastic surgery and cosmetology. The woman met Mike in 2008 when she came in for Botox injections. Initially, there was a purely friendly communication, then a slight flirtation, after a spark between them, and began a romance. Rochelle was a free, accomplished woman. For a long time, she worked as an executive in the NFL, built a successful career, and did not need anything. 4 children are grown. She owed no one anything. Unlike Mike, who was bound by the bonds of marriage, a plastic surgeon began leading a double life. A few months later, his wife found out about the affair and filed for divorce after 20 years of marriage. Mike was so infatuated with Rochelle that he almost did not notice how a huge stage of his life ended. He decisively separated from his wife. For Rochelle, who had never claimed to be married to Mike, an exciting affair from which she wanted only joy and ease turned into a union that required her to be just as maniacally obsessed with her partner. Not getting the attention he expected, Mike tried to pressure Rochelle, which only served to scare her away. Seeing the manipulation and the desire to completely control her life, the young woman decided to part with the plastic surgeon, and in 2010, the paths of former lovers parted. Nevertheless, even after the breakup, Mike for a long time pursued Rochelle, urging her to return. His obsession exceeded all healthy boundaries, forcing Rochelle to decide to move to disappear from his sight and free herself from his oppressive influence. That's how Rochelle found herself in Labico, intent on starting a new life. Dr. Sonnier and the beautiful, cheerful partner quickly hit it off. Gradually, their relationship grew into true love. Sons and relatives willingly accepted the new lover and were happy for Joseph. The man spared nothing for her, showered her with gifts, invited to the best restaurants and private clubs in the city, took her on trips. After Joseph realized that he finally found a worthy woman with whom he was ready to tie his life, he took her to Los Angeles and, in the presence of his entire family, made a proposal. At that moment, Rochelle was 47 years old, and she was literally crazy about her new man. Her personal page and social networks was filled almost daily with love confessions to Joseph. Of course, Mike Dixon couldn't help but see these confessions. The former lover was emotionally shocked to learn that Rochelle not only meets with a new man, but also openly confesses his love and is going to marry him. He realized that it would not be possible to get his former friend back, but he dared to offer her to resume the former format of meetings and become at least lovers. The idea to form a love triangle did not find a response. Rochelle firmly rejected the proposal and told Joseph about everything. After a while, the couple began to feel that they were being watched. At one point, they even noticed something resembling a camera flash through the backyard window, but they didn't pay much attention to it, not fully realizing the seriousness of the problem. The situation spiraled out of control on July 11, 2012. A landscaper who had arrived at the doctor's home to discuss an upcoming remodel contacted emergency services. Upon arriving at the customer's home, he attempted to contact the owner, but received no response. The man noticed an open door and, assuming Joseph might not be able to hear him, went inside. He saw the house in disarray, and most disturbing was the presence of a bullet hole near the front door, indicating a possible intruder. The designer cautiously walked further inside in search of the homeowner and then examined the garage, where he found Joseph Sonnier lying in a pool of blood on the floor with no signs of life. The doctor's body bore evidence of stab and gunshot wounds. Concluding that the perpetrator might be somewhere nearby, the designer immediately left the house and summoned help by telephone. At 2:48 in the afternoon, the police department received a call, and several patrol cars were immediately dispatched to the scene. Arriving officers found the victim of the crime, identified as Joseph Sonnier, a 57-year-old pathologist. Medics confirmed the death of his colleague. The incident shocked the public as it occurred in one of the city's most peaceful, safe, and upscale neighborhoods with virtually zero crime. Dr. Sonnier, a member of a respected profession, was known for his calmness and kindness and had no apparent enemies willing to harm him. Although a window had been broken, what had happened was not a robbery, for nothing was missing from the house. A bottle with the bottom shot through was found at the scene. It appeared to have been used as an improvised silencer for a firearm. A short time later, a forensic team arrived to collect evidence for examination. Apparently, the assailant was inexperienced as he left ample traces of the scene. DNA collected from the bottle used as a silencer, and blood samples found were sent to a lab for further testing. Neighbors interviewed by detectives claimed they did not see or hear anything suspicious. There were no CCTV cameras near the house. According to the investigation, the perpetrator entered the house using a panoramic window overlooking the backyard, a circumstance that made his attack unexpected. In the dining room, the attacker confronted his victim and began shooting. It was most likely at this point that the wine bottle was used as a silencer. Judging by the traces of blood left in the hallway, the doctor was still alive after the shots were fired. He went into the garage, where the attacker caught up with him and stabbed the victim a number of times. An autopsy on the body found 5 gunshot wounds and 11 stab wounds. The circumstances indicated that the murder was not a random crime. What remained unclear was who had done it and why. The investigation focused on the pathologist's close social circle. During an interview with law enforcement, the victim's fiancée recounted strange events in her and Joseph's life in the last months before the tragedy. According to her, it appeared that Dr. Sonnier was being stalked. In addition, Rochelle herself had seen a stranger standing in front of Joseph's house watching the door and windows. She also described persistent calls and texts that began to be received by her fiancé just prior to his death. Officers verified the information, but believed the calls and messages came from other women with whom Joseph appeared to be in a parallel relationship, as there were witnesses who said the man was in contact with several women at once. Investigators asked Rochelle if she was aware of the other women. She answered that she was not. Joseph's sons denied the possibility that their father could have had mistresses, as cheating is not in the character of their father. However, investigators continued to develop a version of the crime motivated by jealousy. At the next interrogation, Rochelle could not withstand the pressure, cried, and admitted that she knew several women, probably involved in the crime. According to her, several former girlfriends were constantly stalking Joseph. He ignored them, but they never stopped expressing their displeasure about his future wedding. One of them turned out to be a lady from Florida who continued to persistently call and write even after Dr. Sonnier revealed his serious relationship with Rochelle. Another was a nurse, a colleague of the pathologist, who also called and wrote to him regularly. The third was a woman with a daughter who, shortly before the murder, had sent a letter to Joseph, accusing him of abandoning her and her child. At the same interview, Rochelle mentioned Mike Dixon for the first time. Until then, she hadn't connected the surveillance of her and Joseph to Mike, since Mike had completely stopped paying attention after her refusal to become a mistress. She assumed he had accepted her marriage and moved on with his life. The police had a viable suspect and they went to talk to the plastic surgeon. Mike willingly went to talk to the detectives. He admitted that he had indeed been deeply in love with Rochelle and had divorced his wife in the name of that love in an effort to create an opportunity for their future together. He admitted that the separation was a blow to him, and for some time he tried to get Rochelle back. She remained adamant, however, and he eventually relented and found a new woman, considerably younger than himself. His new girlfriend, a medical student, confirmed his alibi, as Mike was at work at the time of the crime and then spent time with her. The investigation ran into difficulties. All the suspects, including Rochelle herself, had incontrovertible alibis. Detectives tried to identify possible enemies of the murdered or people financially interested in his death, but no new figures were found. By the time the lab results came back, the situation appeared to be a dead end. The forensic results, unfortunately, did not add any clarity. The DNA sample from the bottle did not belong to the victim. However, the police database was unable to determine whose sample was found at the crime scene. And that's when law enforcement officials got unusually lucky. The police department received a call from Paul Reynolds, an aspiring EMT from Amarillo. According to him, he was sharing housing with a buddy named Dave Shepard, who had recently confessed to a murder committed in Lubbock, after which he attempted to take his own life, but was rescued. Paul relayed information that a neighbor had told him details of the crime. including specific details that only a small circle of detectives might have known, such as the use of a bottle muffler. The officers realized that Shepard was indeed involved in the crime. A witness who called claimed that Dave was only the perpetrator and that the person who ordered the crime was an unknown doctor associated with plastic surgery. Officers immediately began running a background check on the new suspect and found that Shepard had a violent criminal history with theft and hooliganism, but no major crimes. They determined that he was divorced, unemployed, and had been caught stealing on several occasions, including one where he stole $30,000 from a prominent businessman. Dave was taken to the station for questioning, and pretty quickly he began to confess, confirming that Mike Dixon had indeed hired him to commit the crime. According to Dave, the meeting with the plastic surgeon took place in a bar where both found themselves going through painful breakups with their partners. Under the influence of alcohol, the casual conversation turned into a true friendship. Mike Dixon told a sad love story, complained about Rochelle, who had left him and was now about to marry someone else. The man shared that he can't get over his former partner and is willing to do anything to get her back. Deciding that the only obstacle is Dr. Sonnier, Mike and Dave devise a plan. However, their intentions, according to Dave, did not include murder. They simply wanted to slander the pathologist so that proud Rochelle would leave him and want to return to Mike. First of all, they found women who were paid handsome sums of money, $1,000 each, to play the role of mistresses and pursue Sonnier. Then came a letter from a woman with a child claiming that Joseph had abandoned her. Dr. Sonnier denied it each time, and Rochelle believed him. It also turned out that the camera flash the couple had seen was the light from Dave's cell phone flashlight, who regularly drove to their house and played up the surveillance. Each such trip was financed by Mike Dixon, handing out money for gas and related expenses. When spying and slander failed to separate the lovers, Mike set out to fix the problem in a radical way. He told his friend that he wanted him to kill the pathologist. As payment, Dixon offered 3 silver bars totaling about $10,000. Dave agreed. One of the bars given as a deposit, the hired killer immediately cashed in at a pawn shop. According to David Shepard, when he arrived at Dr. Sonnier's house, things got out of control. It was an unintentional shooting. I got scared and he started walking away down the hallway. When I came to my senses from the shock, I shouted, "Dr. Sonnier, are you all right?" Hearing nothing back, I followed him into the garage. He was lying there flat. I distinctly heard his last breath, and I bent down to check his pulse. There was no pulse. In his confession, Shepard claimed that he allegedly stabbed Joseph Sonnier in an irrational and foolish attempt to cover up what he called involuntary manslaughter. "I stabbed him a couple times. I don't remember how many times. You say I stabbed 11 times. I had Dr. Sonnier's phone in my hand, and I thought about dialing the emergency number to call for help, but I didn't. Maybe that's why 11 times. I put the phone back, mutilated the remains, and I went to Mike's, got the rest of the bullion, and tried to kill myself." According to Dave, agreeing to the crime, he did not understand what he was agreeing to, and when he found himself in front of Joseph, he realized that he could not kill. Had it not been for an accidental gunshot, Dr. Sonnier would still be alive. The plastic surgeon was apprehended by police the same day on charges of first-degree murder based on Dave's testimony and an extensive body of other evidence, including compromising phone calls and text messages containing explicit confessions. At the first interview, detectives hoped to elicit a confession, but Mike Dixon stubbornly denied everything, demanding an attorney. A lawsuit ensued. David Shepard, as part of a deal with the prosecutor, immediately pleaded guilty to his role as a hired criminal and waived the right to appeal the sentence. As a result, instead of the death penalty, he received a life sentence without parole. Mike Dixon, against whom there was only circumstantial evidence, pleaded not guilty. Unexpectedly, Dave, who was a key witness for the prosecution, testified during the trial that he committed the crime on his own, without any involvement of Dixon in it. Under oath, he said that the silver bars were intended for investment in a business the two of them had intended to start. The jury was unable to reach a unanimous verdict, and a retrial was declared. The second trial took place in 2016. Dixon was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. An appeal filed by his lawyers led to the reversal of the judgment. The man was released on bail in the amount of $2 million, but the fight for justice did not end. The prosecutor's office sought to have the sentence reinstated by the highest criminal court of the state. Otherwise, a third trial was to be held. The prosecutor's office's motion, filed on February 11, 2019, was granted. In April 2020, the bail was revoked, and an arrest warrant was again issued. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals reversed the lower court's decision and reinstated Mike Dixon's sentence. The judge ruled that the felon must continue to serve his life sentence without parole. Mike Dixon is currently incarcerated in a prison in Lubbock, Texas. Dr. Joseph Sonnier became part of the love triangle when he began dating Rochelle in July 2011. The woman still calls him the main love of her life and regrets that she unknowingly led a criminal to a noble, loving, and honest man. Parents can be very intrusive, arrogant, and demanding in their demands. Sometimes it brings some benefit, and sometimes it does not. There are times when this demanding is even dangerous. Brett Ryan was in just such a situation. He grew up in a prosperous and large Canadian family where his parents, Bill and Susan, had 4 sons. It might seem that having so many children, and especially boys, is hard and exhausting parenting labor. But it wasn't for everyone. Their parents tried to teach the younger Ryans by example. Their father, in addition to his prestigious job at the Toronto Star daily newspaper, had many hobbies, such as sports, yoga, and psychology. And as for Susan, she was very hardworking, and the whole family home rested on her shoulders. She not only gave her time to her husband and children, but also kept a huge house in a prestigious area of Toronto in perfect condition, and all this, without the help of gardeners and craftsmen. Neighbors passing by the family home for a while lingered to admire the huge and blooming garden through the fence. It could not be said that Brett was the family favorite. No, Suzanne loved everyone equally, but from the outside it might have seemed that it was Brett who was scolded least of all for obedience. The thing was, he could always get out of any situation. Even when all the evidence pointed to his involvement, he found a way to prove that he was only partially involved. And amazingly, that ability helped him have a lot of friends. Yeah, Brett was pretty damn popular at school. Everyone wanted to be friends with him, or at least be able to say hello by the hand. Just like his older brothers, Brett went to university after high school. Brett always wanted to be better than his brothers, so he took out an ad in the local newspaper offering Toronto residents a service to paint houses and fences. At first things were going really well. The young man had his first money. Susan was even proud of her son and always held him up as an example to others. But it's one thing when this money is a part-time job, and quite another when you drop out of university to spend all your free time breathing in the smell of paint and not having any education. Yes, after a while, Brett dropped out of university. While for the first couple of years Brett felt confident in front of his older brothers, after a while, when Christopher and Leland graduated and found jobs in their specialties, Brett's authority began to fade. Christopher worked for the City of Toronto Transit Commission, and Leland became the family artist and designer. After their studies, they moved out of their parents' home, and Brett, to avoid spending part of his earnings on rent, stayed with his father, mother, and younger brother, who attended a school for gifted children. With each passing year, Brett became more and more desperate. Because of his debts and inability to pay them off, he developed depression. By 2007, when Brett was already 26 years old, his debt had passed $60,000. Brett was considered a pretty smart guy, but he didn't know how to use his mind. At the same time, he did not show how bad he was. He always smiled, helped everyone, was a participant of volunteer movements. No one could believe how big the black hole in his soul was. Finally came that fateful moment when nothing could be done, at least not legally. On October 28, 2007, Brett had no orders for house painting or any other work around the house. Orders are always extremely scarce in the fall. Everyone who wanted to had already painted their houses in the spring or summer. Winter was approaching, from which you should not expect any big earnings. There was no time to wait for anything. Brett put on all the old clothes he had in his closet. a hat, a long sweater he'd gotten from his older brother, a scarf his mother had knitted. The scarf was comically long. Brett hadn't even worn it before, but finally the scarf came in handy. He wrapped it around his face, leaving only a narrow slit for his eyes, and headed for the bank that was on the outskirts of his neighborhood. He was clutching some thick folder and limped playfully on his right foot. Brett waited his turn at the bank, and when he was finally summoned by an employee, he went up to her and told her in a quiet voice that he had a gun with him. He also told her to take all the money out of the bank's cash register and give it to him. Otherwise, he would shoot here, and the first person he would kill would be her. The girl with trembling hands handed him all the cash she had in the cash register, and Brett quietly walked out of the building so as not to attract the attention of the guards, and when he was on the street, he ran away. He counted the money he had stolen. It wasn't very much, a little over $1,000. To pay off his debts, he would have to rob about 60 banks. Sounds fantastic, but there was no other way out. For the first few days, the novice robber feared that the police would somehow still be able to get to him, so he did not appear at home. He told his mother that he had an order in the neighboring town, and he himself spent the night in the car. Periodically, Brett crept up to his house to see if there was a police car in the bushes. No, it was quiet. No one was looking for him. That's good. So he's headed in the right direction. The first robbery was followed by a second, third, fourth. Brett changed clothes each time. He didn't wear his old clothes anymore. He bought them secondhand, or even found them in the trash. After the crime, he burned the used clothes. Brett also purchased a beard from a store that sold outfits for costume parties. The bank employees he threatened always noticed his beard, and later testified that the attacker was a bearded man. Finally, Brett had a misfire. The police spotted his car on the surveillance cameras and followed him all the way home. By that time, they still had no direct evidence of his guilt. It was decided to just follow the suspect. It was as if Brett sensed the outside surveillance and did not go on a robbery spree for the next 15 days, although before that, the intervals between crimes were 3 or 4 days. The cops thought they were on the wrong trail and wasting their time suspecting an innocent guy, but finally, luck smiled on them. Brett left the house, got into a car, and later got out of the car not far from the bank, wearing a different, strange outfit. He went into the branch, stayed there for a while, but at the exit, he was met by the police to finally handcuff him and announce that the much-discussed bearded robber had finally been caught. Brett was under investigation for 7 months. He was charged with robbery with a firearm. Interestingly, despite having a gun permit, the bearded robber always came to the bank empty-handed. He didn't even have a kitchen knife with him. In total, he was charged with 19 counts and was sent to prison. From there, Brett, just like his family, filed multiple appeals. This yielded results. Only 8 of the 19 counts were upheld. But Brett didn't stop there. As soon as he had the opportunity to apply for parole, he took it. In his petition, Brett asked to take into account the fact that he went to these crimes being in a severe depression, caused by 2 failed relationships, as well as a large amount of debt. At the same time, he once again noted that he went to the crimes without weapons, absolutely not planning to harm anyone. His remarks were accepted, but in order to get out of prison early, he had to undergo a session with a psychologist. The sessions had a positive effect on Brett. All the time he was behind bars, he did not communicate with his family, and now he himself has made a step towards getting closer and restoring relations with his family. The positive changes were noticed by the commissioners, so on November 24, 2010, Brett was released. This freedom, for which the young man fought so zealously, turned out to be very bitter and even harder than it was before. Who was Brett before? A painter with a heavy burden on his soul. What was he now? Brett the bank robber, Brett the ex-con. With such a tainted background, he was never hired by any company, and those who hired him for house painting services, as soon as they recognized him as the bearded robber, refused his services. Also the neighbors, yes, the same ones who used to praise Susan's garden and visit, now began to spread various unpleasant rumors. The whole Ryan family hastily sold the house and moved to Scarborough. Susan started growing her new garden again, and Brett did get a job with a trading company, but his pay was not high. His parents were also helping him with money to rebuild his university education. Brett still visited a psychologist, and each time the specialist advised him the same thing: don't break the connection with your family. The psychologist's advice really worked. Despite this, Brett's financial well-being left much to be desired. In September 2011, the first happy accident in his life happened. He met Kristen Baxter. Kristen was just a fantastic girl. She had her own apartment, the windows of which overlooked the sea, thanks to which the young couple opened a beautiful landscape. She was engaged in sports, which allowed her to keep her body in shape. And most importantly, she did not care about Brett's past. They also traveled periodically as a couple and had even been to Australia. Brett's father and mother, watching his relationship with the girl develop, were very happy. In addition, they were sure that their son will finally take his head, and Kristen will push him in every possible way to develop and finally take his place in society. Brett felt that life was starting to get better, but there was an unfortunate event that was out of his control and that disrupted the building of a new phase. Brett's father died. For him, it was a real shock. His depressive state began to return, because of which Brett began to visit a psychologist more often. He also had to spend a lot of time with his mother and help her with money, which he already had a little. A long relationship with Kristen had to be developed. Young people were not teenagers, which is enough just to meet and spend free time together. Being madly in love with this enchanting blonde, Brett decided to take a serious step. He had some savings, plus he talked to his mother and said that he wanted to build a family with Kristen. And to do this, he needed to make her an offer that Kristen could not refuse him and remember this day for the rest of her life. Susan realized what her son was getting at and gave him money to buy a ring. It should be noted that the couple had discussed their future before that. And no, Kristen didn't need some expensive gift or something like that. It was enough for her to get a proposal from Brett as a confirmation of his serious intentions. But he still decided to splurge and bought a gold ring with a huge diamond for his beloved. Kristen, of course, told him yes. Then, as is usually the case, the young people began planning their wedding. Brett agreed with all of Kristen's decisions and nodded approvingly, but he was horrified at how expensive it was and how much he needed to think about his job. He found an engineering job opening for a large technology company on the internet, put together a resume, and responded to it. He even had a successful interview and was accepted. Brett was happy at the time. He immediately excited his fiancée and his mother with this news, from whom he again asked for money to buy himself an expensive suit to wear to work. Once again, his mother did not refuse her son. When the suit was already bought, Brett received a call from the company saying that they had to refuse him because the security service had found out about his criminal past. For Brett, it was like thunder that broke over him. His mood began to plummet immediately, and he finally gave up. Why waste time on this endless series of interviews, waiting for answers, if in the end, no one wants to hire a criminal, even if corrected? And most importantly, why waste time studying? Brett decided that it would be better to spend the money his mother and older brothers gave him for his university studies on his wedding to Kristen, and so he did. Brett was back in the situation he had recently gotten out of. He didn't tell his family that he had dropped out of university, and most importantly, he didn't tell his counselor. He also didn't tell anyone that he had been turned down for an engineering job. He put on a shirt, tie, suit, and went to paint houses, changing into a change of clothes right on the way, and told his relatives that he was working in an office. In addition, in his social networks, Brett constantly posted various photos from the office, or from some business event, of course, previously downloaded from the internet. And also being near his loved ones, he often pretended as if his phone was ringing and he urgently needed to solve some work issues. He was very skillful at making dust in his eyes, and no one would have thought that Brett was actually a common painter. In September 2016, after a 5-year relationship with Kristen, Brett planned to have a wedding. He even agreed to rent an expensive restaurant where it was necessary to pay $100 for each guest. The whole Ryan family was very happy because Brett finally took himself in hand, has a prestigious job, lives in a fancy apartment, and he has a stunning bride. But they had no idea that Brett's lies had gone too far and there was no way to get out of it unscathed. By then, the wedding was only a month away and the event required an investment. Our hero again and again borrowed money from his mother, and when he realized that she was no longer able to help him, he literally demanded that she change her job to a better-paying one. Also, he planned a bachelor party in August, to which he invited all his friends and brothers. As the fuse of this bombshell began to burn out, Brett still decided to tell his counselor about everything. Brett had been lying to his family for a year about working for a technology company as an engineer. The psychologist was saddened that the guy he'd been leading for so long had gotten off the right track again, and said that Brett just needed to come clean to his mother. Brett thought about it for a long time, procrastinated, but eventually did so. His mother was insanely upset because she had spent so long telling everyone what a wonderful son she had. She also demanded that Brett tell Kristen everything, because if he kept quiet, she would. She also warned her son that his brothers were already aware of the situation and they were on her side. Brett couldn't do that. After all, he'd had such a hard time telling his mother the truth, and he couldn't tell Kristen about his lies. Yes, he knew that there was less than a month until the wedding, which wouldn't happen because of his lying. And indeed, it would have been better for Kristen to know everything in advance, but he still kept quiet. It wasn't clear what Brett was counting on, and he also couldn't help thinking that his mother would really tell his fiancée everything, and then the scandal would be unavoidable. Brett flinched every time Kristen's phone rang, and even stopped breathing until he realized that it wasn't his mother calling, but another friend of his future wife, asking her about her wedding plans and giving her advice. Finally, he figured out how to silence his mother permanently. When Brett was convicted of robbery, he was forbidden to use firearms, so the boy decided that the best way to carry out his plan was to use a crossbow. And besides, it's a pretty silent murder weapon. One of his late father's hobbies was crossbow shooting in the garden at targets. He taught Brett how to shoot too. Yes, he was good at target shooting, except that it was unlikely his late father thought his son would use that skill in such a way. Brett bought the crossbow and arrows at a sporting goods store and hid it behind the construction debris that lay in Susan's garage. At home, he arranged what he thought was an ingenious alibi invention. He tied a spoon to a fan and set the fan itself on a timer. When the timer went off, the fan turned on, and the spoon moved across the computer keyboard, sending pre-prepared comments to YouTube. From the outside, it must have looked like Brett had spent all day at home, watching videos and commenting on them. On the morning of August 25th, Brett dressed up in strange clothes that hid his face, left the house through the back door to avoid the security cameras, and took a train to his parents' house to get rid of anyone who might disrupt his and Kristen's well-being once and for all. Susan was very surprised at her son's unexpected arrival. She had not been feeling well that day, but Brett, despite his mother's condition, once again began to persuade her and even demand not to tell his future wife anything. The mother categorically refused him. Then he began to get angry, and Susan, sensing something wrong, seeing her son's mad eyes, warned him that she had already called Christopher and he was on his way to them. Brett was going crazy. After throwing plastic bags over the body, Brett loaded the crossbow with arrows and hid in the bushes waiting for his brother to arrive. After a while, Christopher arrived, started calling for his mother or his brother, but in response was shot in the neck from behind, which caused him to die within a few minutes. All this time, Leland was in the house, sleeping in his room on the second floor, and had no idea of the carnage that was going on in the garage and in the garden, and most importantly that it was his own brother who was committing the crime. His sleep was disturbed by a scream, and coming downstairs, Leland saw Brett trying to strangle Alexander. A fight broke out between Leland and Brett, and as soon as Leland got the upper hand and managed to push his brother aside, he immediately ran to the neighbors and called the police. Brett stayed in the house. He had nowhere to run. He realized that this was the moment he had completely screwed up his life. There was nothing to do. He took out his phone and wrote Kristen a letter asking her to forgive him. The police arrived at the crime scene and saw a bloody Brett, who was sitting next to his equally bloody but still alive brother Alexander, who would die later in the hospital. Brett himself asked the policeman to handcuff him and take him to the station, where he would confess to everything. He also said that his mother's body was hidden under packages in the garage, but it was impossible to help her. At the police station, and later at the trial, Brett admitted that he did not want to kill Susan. His plan was only to scare her. Christopher and Alexander, on the other hand, he did plan to kill that day, but as witnesses, and if they hadn't arrived, they would still be alive. Just like almost 10 years ago, he tried to justify everything with his depressive state, but it did not soften his sentence. And despite the fact that the judge took into account the fact that Brett confessed to everything himself and did not cause the investigation any trouble, the young man received 3 life sentences, 1 for each murder, with the right to get parole in 2041. As for Leland, he's not speaking to reporters, but he's known throughout Toronto as the sole survivor of that carnage. The summer of 1985 in London turned out to be sunny and warm, breathing nature and tranquility. However, at 3:30 on the morning of August 7th, a sudden phone call rang at the home of Jeremy Bamber, heir to the White House farm. The young man, barely awake, picked up the phone, wondering who could be calling him so early. On the other end of the line was his foster father, his voice sounding unusual. He was clearly panicking, and Jeremy couldn't make out his father's words. He tried to concentrate and realize what had happened, but his son's efforts were futile, and soon there was an eerie silence on the other end of the line. The last thing Jeremy heard from his father was, "Your sister's gone crazy. She's got a gun." An alarmed Jeremy, wasting no time, immediately called the police and reported the frightening conversation, emphasizing the possible danger from his sister. Officers arrived on the scene an hour and a half late after receiving the call. They were followed by Jeremy himself. There was a strange silence and stillness all around. This was suspicious after what the son of the farm owners had described to the police over the phone. Since it was suspected that weapons were involved, the English police decided not to rush inside, which was their professional tactic. The effectiveness of such actions can be discussed endlessly, but it is up to the English authorities. When they arrive at the scene of a call, they are usually unarmed and do not interfere in what is happening, waiting either for the situation to resolve itself or for a special unit to intervene. The police officers remained at a distance from the house, and Jeremy was close to them. They asked him to tell them everything that had happened at the Bumbers' house the night before. According to Jeremy, on the evening of the previous day, they had been sitting around the dinner table as a family. There was a slight misunderstanding at the end of dinner, but nothing serious that could have caused such a tragedy. He also added that he had left his weapons, a pistol and a .22 caliber carbine, with his parents. Both weapons were serviceable and loaded. A special team that arrived on the scene found that all doors and windows in the house were locked, except for the window in the master bedroom on the first floor. Using a loudspeaker, they spent 2 hours trying to communicate with someone in the house, but the only sound that came from the house was the barking of a dog. Nearly 3 hours had passed since the first police officers arrived on the scene. At 8 o'clock in the morning, the SWAT team finally made their way inside the house, where an eerie silence reigned. The group moved carefully around the first floor, looking carefully through the rooms. As they approached the kitchen, they witnessed chaos. An overturned chair lay on the floor, and in a pool of blood lay the lifeless body of a man. It was Neville Bamber, Jeremy's father. Neville's body looked disfigured, bruises and abrasions on his arms and face, a broken nose and jaw, as if he had fought fiercely. There was no way to help him. 8 bullet wounds, including 6 to the head, had completely eliminated his chances of survival. On one of the surfaces of the kitchen lay a telephone with its receiver removed, next to several rounds of .22 caliber ammunition. The picture shocked the police officers, but they had to move forward to investigate the entire house in detail. It was decided to scrutinize the first floor first, and then move to the second floor if there were no other family members present. Every step had to be controlled to avoid unnecessary noise, but this proved to be a difficult task given the creaky floor of the old house. There was no one else on the first floor, but on the second floor, in 2 bedrooms, 4 more bodies were found. June, Sheila, and 2 small boys, Daniel and Nicholas. They had all been killed by gunshots. June had been shot 7 times, Daniel and Nicholas 5 and 3 shots each. Sheila was lying on the doorstep of her parents' bedroom with 2 bullet wounds under her chin and a gun in her hands. 25 bullets had been used to kill 5 family members. That number of bullets raised questions. Was it possible that someone had deliberately decided to take out the bummers on purpose, and what was the motive? Could it be that the real culprit was trying to mislead the police? Answers to all of these questions were needed, and authorities immediately began investigating and began researching the history of all members of the dead family. The history of the Bamber family. The county of Essex, with its nature, is in close proximity to the noisy and crowded London, where there is always an endless stream of tourists flowing. Nevertheless, it retains its value in the eyes of the locals, providing a haven from the bustling capital. The county invites you to relax body and soul, enjoy the fresh air, stroll through endless green meadows, taste crystal clear lake water, visit medieval castles, and immerse yourself in fascinating stories. It was probably these benefits that made Essex an attractive destination for the Bamber family, who decided to settle here. June and Neville, with the acquisition of White House Farm, were able to make their dream come true. In 1949, at the age of 25, June married Neville and the couple set off to their farm, aiming to build a strong and prosperous family. Neville, a veteran of the Royal Air Force, having completed his years of service, took on the role of magistrate of the local court. However, fate presented the couple with several unforeseen twists and turns. June's long efforts to get pregnant proved futile, but they did not despair and decided to turn to an orphanage to take in their family 2 children. So, Sheila, at just 3 months old, and later Jeremy, at 6 months old, became part of their lives. June and Neville proved to be caring parents, filling their children's days with love and care. Growing up, their children received an excellent education from them at prestigious private schools. The Bummers' financial situation was extremely prosperous, allowing them to provide their children with every opportunity. Jeremy, despite the brilliant education, was characterized by a withdrawn character and preferred solitude from childhood. His tendency to rebelliousness was evident in elementary school, where he did poorly, which led to his parents' decision to send him to boarding school in 1970 when he was 9 years old. The English boarding schools of the time were rigid, and Jeremy quickly realized that there would be strict discipline. The years at boarding school were difficult, but may have played a role in changing Jeremy's character for the better. Having excelled at university, he became more calm, and his parents were proud of their son. After successfully completing university, Jeremy's father, Neville, offered him a job on a farm in England. The young man immediately accepted the offer, and in 1982, he returned from the journey he had been on since completing his studies. His parents provided him with comfortable accommodations, including a cottage, a car, and a good salary. They also counted on him to help them in their old age. However, despite outward success within the family, Jeremy faced tensions related to religious differences. June, a deeply religious woman, experienced turbulent emotions because her children did not share her religious beliefs. Her attempts to guide them toward faith were futile. Difficulties in family relationships and frustration led her to depression. She underwent treatment that included the use of electroshock, which at the time was considered a method of dealing with mental illness. Sheila, June, and Neville's daughter also had a significant impact on her mother's development of depression. Unlike her calmer brother Jeremy, she was fascinated by the fashion world and dreamed of becoming a model. But June adamantly denied the idea, not wanting to hear about her daughter being involved in the world of show business. These were just a few of the many surprises Sheila gave her parents. At the age of 17, she announced she was pregnant, and June was faced with a difficult choice: forbid her daughter to have a child out of wedlock, as it was religiously unacceptable, or force her to have an abortion, which is also forbidden in the Christian world. In the end, June relieved herself of all responsibility and asked Sheila to make the decision herself, but in such a way that no one in their family would ever know that she had gotten rid of the pregnancy. The result was a deterioration in the relationship between mother and adopted daughter. In 1977, Sheila did marry Colin Cuffell, the father of her first unborn child, despite her parents' protests. The young men became a family and soon had twins, Nicholas and Daniel. However, after some time, Sheila began to suspect her husband of infidelity and filed for divorce. This had a serious impact on her mental health. Sheila spent several months in a psychiatric hospital where she was also treated with electroshock therapy just like her mother. Meanwhile, Sheila's sons were sent to an orphanage where they stayed for almost 2 years. Sheila's health only worsened. She became anxious, often expressing a desire to take her and her children's lives, claiming that they were under the influence of the devil. She suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, while Jeremy, who used to cause a lot of problems for his parents, calmed down and was happy with his life on the farm. In 1985, Sheila met up with her ex-husband Colin again, and they reunited, taking their sons from the orphanage. In August, Sheila and her children were invited to the Bamber home to meet her parents. They were going to stay there for a week, after which Colin and the boys were to take a trip to Norway. He brought Sheila and the children to the farm, and on Tuesday, August 6, 1985, everyone gathered at the beautiful White House farmhouse. It turned out to be the last dinner of the Bamber family. A few days after the tragedy, the Bumbers' funeral was held, and naturally Jeremy attended. It was a difficult and bitter moment for him. He cried a lot and was shocked by what had happened. But it was on this day that the investigation took a new turn. Strange behavior was noticed in Jeremy's behavior, which relatives of the Bamber family reported to the authorities. During breaks between bouts of grief and tears, he would utter ridiculous phrases, referring to himself as the boss. Those around him saw a smile on his face, and it was an unusual smile, but a smile characteristic of a contented winner. All these observations and remarks were passed on to the authorities, and they decided to investigate more thoroughly. On this ill-fated evening, everything seemed perfect. A family dinner, a joyous mood, a delicious meal. However, one comment made by Neville in June changed things. The parents suggested that Sheila send the children back to the orphanage, emphasizing that she was unable to provide them with a proper upbringing. This provocative suggestion displeased Sheila, and she reacted sharply, saying that she was already thinking about it and would make a decision on her own. The warm atmosphere of the evening was broken. At 9:30 p.m., Jeremy headed to his house. At the same time, Barbara Wilson, the secretary of the Bamber farm, called with a work-related matter. Neville picked up the phone, and Barbara noticed that he was irritable. There were loud voices in the background. People seemed to be arguing excitedly. This atmosphere amazed Barbara, for such a thing was a rare occurrence for the Bummers. She was unable to find out the cause of the conflict, however, as Neville quickly ended the conversation and hung up the phone. The next morning, all the family members in the house were found shot dead. Jeremy was the only one of the family left alive. He was unable to hide his tears. Investigators were respectful of his emotions and gave Jeremy time to recover before beginning interviews. Jeremy shared all the information available, not forgetting to mention the difficulties his sister had faced in life and the conflict over dinner on the evening of August 6th before he left the house. At first glance, the crime committed by Sheila appears to be a desperate and certainly unconscious act, given her mental state. Under the influence of a parental remark, she could not stand the new invasion of her privacy, lost her mind, and resorted to gun violence, shooting the Bummers, her children, and herself. Investigators were certain that's exactly what happened. During an examination of the house, it became clear that the crime, which destroyed almost the entire family, was committed by the Bambers' mentally unstable adopted daughter, Sheila. This was evidenced by the weapon found lying on her body, pointing upwards towards her chin. The actions of the detectives subsequently seem rather absurd. The police decided to put the house in order and to organize a strange process of burning the bloody bedding and carpets on which the bodies were lying. The police reasoned that they wished to rid Jeremy of the horrible memories of what had happened, and the weapon found at the scene, which was potential evidence, was picked up by the officer with his bare hands. Reopening the investigation required a thorough examination of the scene to avoid jumping to conclusions. The first step was for detectives to examine the weapon. Several people's fingerprints were found on the barrel, including the investigator, who apparently picked up an important piece of evidence without using gloves. The presence of Sheila's and Jeremy's prints didn't raise any questions. Jeremy confirmed that it was his gun, designed for hunting. He had purchased it legally. Sheila's prints, being a suspect in this crime, were quite expected. However, it is worth noting that the alleged perpetrator was shot twice in different parts of her body. How did she manage to subsequently take her own life? And that's where things started to become clearer. Suddenly, Julie, Jeremy's girlfriend, began to express doubts about his innocence. She contacted investigators and provided them with some curious details. On the night of August 7th, Jeremy called her, reporting problems at the farm. However, when Julie tried to find out more, Jeremy abruptly hung up. In addition, she recalled that several times before the tragedy, Jeremy had complained to her about his family, expressing fatigue with his in-laws. But the most shocking aspect of her testimony concerned the Bummers' will. It turns out that the Bummers had made a will stating that all of their property was to go to their children upon their death, half to each. And also their mother was going to rewrite their share in favor of the twins, Sheila. This fact turned Jeremy against his sister. He did not like this prospect, and he openly shared it with his friend. Besides, Neville's will stated that Jeremy would have to work on the farm to get his share of the inheritance. But the worst part was when Julie heard him say how Jeremy dreamed of killing his family and putting the blame on the mentally unstable Sheila. He demonstrated some good acting skills by portraying himself as a witness to the tragic drama in front of the police officers. According to Julie, she told the police about it not only out of a desire to help in the investigation, but also out of a thirst for revenge, having learned about Jeremy's mistress. In an attempt to cover his tracks and draw the detective's attention away from himself, Jeremy gave the police the name of a potential suspect. He targeted a plumber he supposedly hired to work on the property. However, this cunning plan did not work. The plumber was found and interrogated, but his alibi was solid. The plumber not only did not understand why he was being questioned about the crime, but also provided clear evidence that he was elsewhere at the time of the events. Thus, the circle of suspects was narrowed down to one, Jeremy Bamber himself. Despite his temporary arrest, the lack of concrete evidence led to his release. Moreover, the police did not restrict his travel abroad, although it was known that after the inheritance, Jeremy's financial condition had improved markedly. Soon, he had already left England and traveled to Saint-Tropez, France, to enjoy a vacation. And a few days before, he easily got rid of his father's car by selling it. Jeremy's cousins demanded that the version that Sheila killed her family be reconsidered. They went to the police and the media, to which the deputy head of the CID once ordered the Bamber cousins to leave his office when they asked him to consider that James Bamber had arranged the whole thing. Afterward, one of the brothers decided to inspect the scene in secret from the others. His strong doubts about Sheila's involvement in the murder prompted him to look for more evidence. By then, Jeremy had gotten the keys to his parents' house and was living there all alone. His cousin managed to get through the door and around every corner of the house, hoping to find some new evidence, and his search was successful. In one of the closets, he found an item that gave him a shock, a silencer for a .22 caliber carbine with traces of blood. It was something that spurred him to new conclusions. The length of the weapon, including the installed silencer, told him that the assailant would not have been able to turn it on himself and shoot himself. This meant that Sheila could not have been involved in the crime. Having been shot twice and bleeding, she would not have been able to remove the silencer and hide it deep in the closet. But assuming that she fired without this additional device, a new question arises. Why were there traces of blood on the end of the silencer? Thus, it only confirmed that it had been fitted to the carbine at the time of the crime. On September 29th, Jeremy returned home and was immediately arrested and charged with the murder of the Bamber family. The trial, which lasted 18 days, began on October 3, 1986, at Chelmsford Crown Court. Jeremy Bamber looked arrogant as he took his seat in the dock. Throughout the trial, prosecutors accused him of lying. The station's telephone technicians checked and confirmed that the phone line at Bamber's home was busy that night. The medical examiner's testimony at trial was key. Injuries on Neville's body found by the experts included several bruises, indicating that the elderly man had resisted blows. The medical examiner suggested that Neville had been beaten with the very same .22 caliber carbine. However, given Sheila's frailty and short stature, it is doubtful that she could have inflicted such serious injuries on her father before his death. it is more likely that Jeremy was capable of such an act. Neville's body was covered in bruises, and it is obvious that Sheila must have also taken a few blows during the fight. However, there were no signs of beatings or bruises on her body. Jeremy's lawyers insisted that Sheila, despite her mental problems, was physically fit and capable of crime. Her experience with guns and excellent shooting skills were arguments that she could have committed the crime. They also noticed that Sheila's blood was fresher than that of other family members, which, in their opinion, indicated the likelihood that she had first massacred her family and then herself. This may have been the result of a realization of her act or, as the defense lawyer suggested, a reaction to the approaching police officers. After hearing these theories, the prosecution unequivocally refuted them. The silencer was found in the closet with traces of blood belonging to Sheila, although, logically, it should have been on the carbine. These statements were irrefutable. The defense was in a difficult position and had no more arguments to counter the prosecution's case. According to the prosecution, the motive for the crime was Jeremy's anger at learning of the divided will. The money was the reason he had arranged the bloodbath. On the day of the incident, the housekeeper saw Sheila and did not notice anything unusual in her behavior. The day before, 2 employees had also seen her with the children and said she was happy and adequate. According to the testimony of Barbara Wilson, the farm clerk, she called Neville at about 9:30 p.m. and was under the impression that she had broken off an argument. Barbara said that Neville was not happy and seemed to hang up in annoyance, which he had never done before. In her opinion, he was a calm man. It was at this time, between 10:30 and 10 o'clock, that Jeremy left his in-laws and headed home. Late at night, he returned on the bicycle he had borrowed from his mother a few days before the events, avoiding the main road so as not to be seen. Taking advantage of an open window in a first-floor room, Jeremy got inside and found a pre-prepared and loaded gun. When he entered his parents' bedroom, he fired 2 shots, killing Jane. Then he pointed the gun at Neville, but his father woke up and tried to defend himself. A struggle ensued, during which father and son went downstairs, and there Jeremy was able to kill his father in the kitchen. He then returned to the bedroom where he finished off Sheila and her children. To make it appear that his sister was guilty of the crime, Jeremy placed the carbine in the dead Sheila's hands. Afterward, he returned to his bike and headed home. He first called his friend Julie and almost gave himself away with excitement, and then called the police, talking about his father allegedly calling. This call also raised questions for the investigation. If Neville was in danger, he probably would have gone to the police, not to his son. And the phone in the Bamber house was not covered in blood, even though the father, according to Jeremy's testimony, was probably injured at the time of the call. This suggested that the telephone receiver in the house had been removed for staging. Jeremy's own behavior also raised suspicions. Why, after his father called, did he not rush to the scene? After all, it was his family. Based on all the known facts and assumptions, the jury retired to deliberate on the verdict. Before doing so, the judge pointed out 3 main questions to the jury. They had to decide who should be believed, Julie Mugford or Jeremy Bamber. It was also important to find out if they were convinced that Sheila did not commit the crime. The judge emphasized that this issue was linked to another important question. Was the second fatal shot fired at Sheila fired with a silencer? If the answer is yes, that eliminated the possibility that she could have committed the shot. Finally, was a call from Neville Bamber to his son actually made in the middle of the night? The absence of such a call undermined Jason's entire version of events. On October 28th, after more than 9 hours of deliberation, the jury unanimously found Jason Bamber guilty by a majority vote of 10-2, the minimum required for conviction. He was sentenced to 5 life sentences in prison without parole. Home Secretary Douglas Hurd ruled in 1988 that Bamber should not be released. The case remains a matter of controversy, despite there being no direct evidence that Jeremy Bamber is guilty. He is serving his sentence. There is a belief that there may have been a miscarriage of justice, and the true culprit is his sister Sheila. Bamber insists on his innocence by filing appeals. His lawyer argues that the judgment was biased because of Jeremy's aggressive behavior in court. Jeremy Bamber believes that there is no evidence of his guilt, and there are many unexplained points in the case. Tests on Sheila's hands were not conducted, there was police misconduct at the scene, and there remained speculation of retaliation by Jeremy's ex-girlfriend. A trial was held in 1991 at Bamber's request, but in 1996, a police officer destroyed much of the physical evidence. Jeremy's defense team called it a disgrace. In 1997, a DNA test was conducted that showed the presence of Sheila and June's blood in the silencer, but the results were complicated and ambiguous. In 2012, gun experts from the US and UK argued that the injuries on the bodies were not consistent with the use of a silencer. In 2015, Jeremy Bamber filed an appeal demanding that all evidence be turned over to the defense, under the guise of a lawyer, for which he was sentenced to an additional 14 years in prison for fraud. Seeking proof of his innocence, Bamber set up websites to discuss the case and offered a large reward for evidence that could overturn his conviction. The Bamber family's case continues to attract public attention and raise doubts about the correctness of the verdict. What do you think about it? Is Jeremy guilty?